Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Asian Pacific American History Month. Thank you all so much for joining us as we celebrate API Stories here at CAMFest 2021. My name is Grace Moss, and I will be moderating today's conversation. I'm the VP of Equity and Inclusion for WarnerMedia. And for our audience members with low vision, I'm Filipina, and I have long black wavy hair, and I'm wearing a sweater that is black and brown, and I've got some artwork in the background. And I'd love to introduce Karen Horne, who we've got here as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Grace. I am Karen Horne. I am Senior Vice President of Equity and Inclusion for WarnerMedia. I am a biracial Black woman. I have long curly hair, and today I am wearing a blue shirt that has like white and maroon flowers on it or some kind of design. And anyway, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Karen. And we also have Zao Wang, director and filmmaker, joining us as well.
Hey, thanks, Grace. Hello, Karen. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I am a writer-director. I'm in the HBO Access class of 2021, and I am Chinese American. I have short hair, black rim glasses, blue shirt, and I'm speaking from my office.
Great, thanks, Al. And we also have here as our ASL interpreter, Kimberly Costi. So thank you, Kimberly, for joining us today and doing the ASL interpretations. So we are going to have a very insightful conversation on breaking into the TV industry through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to talk about fellowship programs, and we're going to talk about WarnerMedia's efforts to amplify underrepresented voices. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to dive into the first question. For Karen, WarnerMedia recently launched the WarnerMedia Access Writers Program, and I'd love if you could just give a snapshot of what is this program, how does it work, and what is the ultimate goal?
Sure. So the WarnerMedia Access Writers Program is an effort to first of all, take some of the existing programs that were within the WarnerMedia family, like the HBO Writers Access Program, and scale them across our enterprise. WarnerMedia consists of a lot of different companies that many people don't know belong to WarnerMedia, like HBO, HBO Max, Warner Brothers Television, the Turner Networks, Cartoon Network, and many more. And in scaling a writing program to go across the enterprise, we have the ability to give opportunities to writers who have historically been underrepresented in our community and in our industry, and scale it across our entire enterprise. So if there's a writer who is best suited for the comedy of Warner Brothers Television, we can service them. If they're best suited for writing and animation at Cartoon Network, we can service them. If they're best suited for creating huge worlds like HBO does so well, we can service them here. It's an opportunity for the best writers to come in and not only learn about our industry and our company, but also to be able to hone their skills and their craft to make their writing undeniable. And then we work to get them placed in our within WarnerMedia. Our efforts are really to keep them as a part of our family and to have them grow their careers within WarnerMedia.
That's awesome. And Zao, you mentioned you're currently in the HBO Access Directors Program. Can you talk about what that experience has been like? What are some of the things that you've learned and some of your biggest takeaways thus far?
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I actually applied 2 years ago, and I made it to the final round, but I didn't get in. So, I promised myself that I want to do it again. So when I applied last year, I was very honored to be a part of the HBO class. I have to say, it happened during the pandemic. So first of all, having a community of filmmakers and a support network was so crucial. and I was able to get to know everybody, even on Zoom. We had our week. The first week was a week of workshop and talks from directors and showrunners. We invited Mark Milo and Jay Roche and Mary Lou and Michael Goy, among others. And it was incredibly eye-opening to see, their process when it comes to TV directing or producing. And it was also very much just a dialogue where you can ask questions about their process, about the TV world, especially on some of these, favorite shows like Succession or, movies like Meet the Parents. I think at the end of the day, it's about having a support network that you'll carry throughout your career. And so much of this business, I think it's about relationship, right? There's a creative aspect of it, but there's also the relationship side of things. And, people go from show to show and you're bound to run into other people and the people you've met years ago will definitely have your path cross. And so I think it's really about people business, in addition to developing your own creative process and preparation. And I think that's also a big part of that.
That's great. Thanks, Al. And this question is for both of you as well, since you have very different purviews into this world. There's obviously so many other programs across the industry at various networks and studios, and I'd love to hear from your unique perspectives. Can you share some of your best tips as far as having a strong submission? How do you make yourself stand out? And for Karen, can you describe some of those submissions that stand out when they come across your desk, whether it's the sample or the application itself? Karen, why don't you start, then we can go with Zao.
Sure. I think you can always see the passion of the applicant in their work. I think the lens in which a director tells a story affects the way we see that story. A director can change a script and amplify it and make it better, or they can take that same script and really kill it with their work by trying to be too directy, if that's a word. And I think on the writing side, you can, if a story stays with you, if you read something and those characters pop for you and you really care about them and you remember them, those are all things that make me remember an applicant and make their work stand out for me. I think for those interested in applying to programs, what they should do is just follow their passion and don't tell the story that they think we want to see or we want to read or watch. Tell what they're passionate about, because that's going to make their work so much better. That passion always comes through on an applicant, and that's the thing I think that separates them from, the person who is just giving us what they think we want to see.
That's great. And Zao, you've done not just HBO's program, but Sony and Bad Robot. So you've gone through this process a couple times. What are some of the best practices you've learned along the way? Because those applications are fairly lengthy, and there's, we ask for your portfolio and a lot of other components. So can you talk about some of your best practices or lessons you've learned along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100% with what Karen was saying. At the end of the day, it was really about who you are as a storyteller. And there's the same story can be told through different lenses and what makes you unique. And that's something you have to embrace. Honestly, it took me, in the beginning of my career, I don't think I really understood what that meant. But over the years, as you mature, as a person, as an artist, you learn to embrace that. You learn to embrace and amplify what makes you unique. And I think in the process, the interviews and the applications, it's about bringing that part of you to your audience, to the people that you're talking to. And I think that, it's a process that gets refined every time you go through an interview. So that in itself has been really rewarding in just saying, okay, well, this is who, knowing who you are, knowing what you are passionate about, but then there's also a way to talk about what you're passionate about. I think that's the value in applying to these programs and be a part of these communities, is that you are sharpening and focusing on the things that you're passionate about and finding a way to communicate that. So I think that has been the most rewarding, and also just having these communities that you carry with you throughout your career.
I'll just add on to that.
Yeah.
You know, I can look to Zao as a great example, you know, of a person whose talent I, you know, for one, wholeheartedly believes in, and he is my goal of making sure that he becomes a household name. But I will say, you know, Zao and I first met while we were at NBC, and he submitted to the NBC Short Film Festival. And I couldn't stop talking about him throughout the industry. So I told, you know, colleagues at Sony, and I told colleagues at HBO, and anyone else how tremendous he was. And I remember when J.J. Abrams and Bat Robot were starting up their directing efforts, and was so excited that Zao got to participate in that. So I think that one thing many people may not know about the work we do in these roles is we don't do them solely just for WarnerMedia or NBC Universal. We do them to lift the entire industry. And, you know, it is my extreme desire for Zao to make it here and to stay within WarnerMedia, but it's mostly my desire to see Zao make it and have a career in this industry. He really deserves it.
Yeah.
I just want to add one more thing. You know, it like I was saying about community, I think it's that important because, you know, Karen has been my staunch supporter from the very beginning of my career, and, you know, she got my agent. So that, you know, I think that's part of what this process is about, you know, finding your tribe of people and you know, really stick together. And you know, the sense of community, it's so important, and I think that's what these programs really provide.
Yeah, I think it's true. You know, they say a rising tide lifts all boats. So whether it's at NBCU or Warner or whatever it is, the ultimate goal is to uplift these underrepresented, you know, content creators. And I think you're a wonderful example, Zao. We have an audience question that I wanted to fold into our convo. You know, what is something unexpected, Zao, that you've learned about yourself or the industry through the various fellowships that you've participated in? And you've spoken about best tips and advice and staying true to yourself, but through those processes that you've gone through, what have you learned about yourself that is something that you weren't expecting to learn?
Well, you know, I think the most obvious thing is to be exposed to different filmmakers and different shows and different producers, and to see what their process is like. And I think the biggest takeaway for me really is about developing your own process in your prep work. And I think in television, and that's something that I really learned from shadowing from these programs and meeting, you know, filmmakers is, you know, filmmaking is preparation, but especially in television, because you as a director has such short period of time to do all the work that's necessary for you to bring in a good episode. So preparation has been a huge key for me, and I think you have to find your own process for that, and that really comes from, you know, with these programs and shadowing, and you know, use this opportunity to develop your own skill and what works for you. You know, like I always say, it's like in these martial art movies where, you know, you see a guy practicing for like years, and then, you know, well, you're getting ready to do that one episode, you know, when the opportunity comes. So you really need to take this time to prep and to exercise those directing muscles and script analysis muscles and shot listing muscles. Yeah.
Cool. And I think that is such a good point you're making. Like, relationships in this industry, I think both you and Karen made this point, are everything. And it's not necessarily who you know, but who knows you. And I think through these fellowships, it's very important for me and Karen on our end to make sure that all of our creative executives know the talent that we're cultivating. So that's a great point. For both of you, and Karen, maybe you can start with this one. Obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done and change is happening, but very slowly. Curious to know, an audience member here asked, if you had a magic wand to fix one thing in media right now, what would it be?
I don't know that I would use a magic wand to fix it. I want people to learn. I think if you had a magic wand, you could change something and it would change for a moment. I think our goal at WarnerMedia is not to change one thing, but to change the systems which have created the built landscape that our industry suffers from, quite frankly. This is an industry that was built on systemic racism. And so what we are trying to do is to build new systems that will change that racism that built our industry. I think we have to teach people to be comfortable in scenarios that they were generally uncomfortable with. And if that means having people to share your writer's room, or having people to share the directing efforts that don't mirror you, and if that makes you uncomfortable, then that's what we want to help people become comfortable with. We often say that if you are building a toolbox and you have 8 wrenches in them, why would you get another wrench? Why would you get a 9th or a 10th wrench? You need to make your work stronger, and you can do that by bringing different views, different points of view. So I don't know that I would use a magic wand, because I want people to understand what got us here and how we can change to be better. And also, more importantly, to know that it's just good business. I don't believe that we do this to check a box or to fill a quota. That's not how we operate here either at WarnerMedia. We understand the business of equity and inclusion, of being inclusive. We serve global audiences, and no one is a monolith within those audiences. So to recognize that it is good business to create programming and content that doesn't necessarily represent one point of view will make us better in our business.
That's great. I love that response. Thanks, Karen.
Oh,
So, what about you? If you had a magic wand, what would you want to address in the industry?
Oh, magic wand. Oh, well, I guess first of all, let's just make the pandemic go away. I mean, yeah, I agree with Karen. I think as a creator, you want to create things that people haven't seen, right? You want to do something new and refreshing, or a similar genre story, but told through a different lens, through a different perspective. And I think I'm definitely beginning to see the change in the industry. There's more opportunities, or people are more open to those kind of stories. And I think that's great. I don't know if there's a magic wand that can fix everything, but it takes time. It takes everybody's effort, and people in front of the camera, behind the camera, and people working on a broader picture, like Karen, and I think so by supporting more filmmakers with different perspectives, I think that will begin the shift in the perspective in the industry, and just in what we are used to see on screen. If we haven't seen this before, then people are going to be a little nervous, and like, okay, well, we haven't seen this, but the more things that are happening, more we make and are allowed to be seen, then people will have a certain familiarity with it and be like, oh yes, it's kind of like that, and great. So I think it's a slow process, but it's happening.
That's great. I've got one more question for Karen before we move to the Q&A. Karen, obviously our team has a lot of work to do at the company. What are some programs that our audience should look forward to that are coming down the pike as far as pipeline programs this year or early next year?
Oh, so excited. So like the writing program, we're going to take the directing program that was previously the HBO Directors program and scale that across the enterprise as well. We're going to build that. We're building an animated shorts program with HBO Max. We are going to do a content or showrunners program, and that will be an invite-only program, but it's for those people who are in the mid to upper level of their writing careers, to pair them with producers who are in our overall deals. And it hasn't even, so here's a sneak, newsflash, it's not even been announced yet, but we're at our press people will probably kill me for this because I'm stealing the announcement. So, but we understand that if a writer goes the normal route to start at a staff writer level and then work their way up to a showrunners level, that can take up to 12 years. And if you're a person of color, it could probably take you longer because historically those people have had to repeat levels more often than the white writers have. And so we want our content, we want new content immediately. We want content through a different lens immediately. So we're building things in place to do that. We're also working with CNN and our sports team to build programs with them in our film division as well to build programs throughout there. So any place that WarnerMedia exists, we're trying to touch those places. I will encourage anyone, if you have a gaming background, give us a call. We are looking for you. If you virtual production, give us a call. We're looking for you as well. Those are areas that we're keenly focused on and opening it up to more diverse voices as well.
Great. Awesome. Well, we did receive some questions from our audience in advance. And so for this first one, Zao, I would love if you can take it. The audience member writes, as a POC filmmaker, what other avenues or resources do you suggest for getting myself out there beyond these incredibly helpful but also highly competitive fellowships? So obviously everyone here is going to apply to our programs. What else can they do besides the programs?
I think CAM is definitely one of the resources that I often check to see, the fellowships or programs, and Sundance is another one of those programs. But just also within Sundance are different, the Sundance Collab, and there's different areas within Sundance that you can apply to, or just to learn, just to see what people are doing and to be a part of another community, right? And I think that's a big part of it. And I think all the Asian American film festivals for me has been extremely helpful in terms of getting the exposure and getting to know people and form relationships. At sooner or later, people will be like, "Oh, yes, I heard Karen talking about you," or "I heard, from Kelly," or So I think that's really important to just get yourself out there, get your work out there as much as possible, as wide as possible. Yeah.
And to your point, it's oftentimes content creators or filmmakers, or writers or directors and folks very much put a lot of emphasis on those that can help them, that are maybe higher up. But I think those peer relationships are just as important, because they may have leads or, put your name on the radar of somebody else. So I think that's really important, not to just look for those who are hiring or EPs or showrunners. Karen, for you, when building DE&I programs, and I know you've been doing this successfully for so long now, where do you look for inspiration or for guidance?
I operate kind of from the supply and demand, philosophy. Where is there a demand, and how do we create a supply for it? Luckily, for our programming, there's a lot of demands, so there's room for a lot of supply. But I also work very closely with our creative teams. I think, having a background, I was a producer, I was a creative executive. Grace, working with you and your background and the alternative space brings a different prospect to, that I don't have, and building a team around me that can provide insight into the areas that I don't have is very helpful. But mostly it's just, finding where there is a need and then building the supply for that. And making sure that the talent we champion and those we recruit and develop is undeniably the best talent, period. I've often said that you can check every proverbial so-called box, which we don't do, but you can check all the boxes. But if you're not talented, then you're not going to have any, career with me, because it's always talent first. And who we are and our reputation is only as good as the people we champion. So I would, really, that's my philosophy, is to find the best talent to fill the demands that we often have throughout our industry.
That's awesome. Yes, Zao.
Yeah, I just want to add to it. I think mentorship is also extremely important, because once you have a relationship with someone, that you can go to that person, ask for advice and think, career advice or on a specific topic. I've reached out to Karen many times, and also just throughout my path, people who have, either want to be my mentor, or I would, ask to be like, hey, I have some questions. I really want some answers, and I want to get your perspective on things. And I think that those relationships are so important, because once you get to know someone on a personal level, the advice and I think you can get really the insider's view into a certain topic. People like Era LaSalle and Gabe Sachs and James Rowland, all these people that I've worked with, and they have always been there. And I have their personal contact info that you can text them with a question, and then they get back to you right away. So I really think everybody in this industry wants to help each other, and especially once you form that relationship, it's going to be super important along your path.
Totally agree. It really does take a village outside of just, you obviously have the talent, but then you need those advocates around you, whether it's through the programs or the networks and personal networks. It's very, very true. So the last question, I think this is a fun one to end on, is more of a creative interest question here. So what is on your streaming queue or on your bookshelf right now? And what content or creators out there are you excited about or inspired by? Karen, do you want to go first, or Zao? Yeah,
I'll start. So everything on HBO Max is on my so subscribe right now, HBO Max. No, honestly, I think HBO Max is doing some amazing programming, and everything that WarnerMedia does at some point will find its way to Max. I love. I will say I had a great time this past year watching shows like Lovecraft Country, and I think that's a great example of telling a story through a different lens. I'm excited to see the Nevers and that type of thing. On the book, I am working through Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast, which is an amazing book. I'm also rereading Jane Eyre. Because my kid said, you should, let's talk about this. And I was like, well, I don't remember. So I got to reread it. So that's rereading of mine. And, I also find a lot of time for the great, the baking shows and the cooking shows and the design shows, just to kind of get my head out of some of the craziness that our world is always experiencing.
And if I could just add on to that HBO Max tip, specifically for May, they have a whole vault of API content. It's called CS, and they've really curated, by theme and by sort of anything that you could wish for, all by API filmmakers. So very, very worth checking out. Zao?
Yeah, Karen, I was gonna, talk about the same book by Isabel Wilkerson, Cast, and it was such a life changing, story. I have that right back there, and so there's that, and also been rereading Greek tragedies. I don't know why it got me back into that, but haven't read it since college, but just revisiting some of the really basic human, tragedies and comedies, especially during this very challenging time. And Shakespeare has been a great friend during the pandemic. And recently, I just read Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown, and that to me has been like such like what this is so awesome and like crazy and in all the best ways. And of course, in the same vein, I think Lovecraft Country is in that same kind of genre bending, but with such a fresh perspective. I just love that. And also Instagram. I follow a lot of music video directors and just getting inspired by different forms and different media.
And I to just add, the creators I'm most excited about, I'm not just saying that because he's here, but Zao Wang. I mean, like, honestly, like, I cannot wait, like, for me to say I told you so to a gazillion people, because honestly, from the very first short I've seen of Zao's to the work he continues to do is he's one of the best. So I cannot wait to see that.
I second that. Well, it has been such an awesome conversation. Thank you both for being here. Again, I want to give a very special thank you to Karen Horne from WarnerMedia, Zao Wang, and Kimberly Costi for helping us make this accessible. This has been, again, a great conversation, and I thank you all for joining us today.
And to Grace Moss, who is like the best colleague a person could have, and also an awesome moderator. So
absolutely.
Thanks,
Thank
Karen.
you, Grace.
Thanks, you guys.
And thank you, Karen. Good to see you.
You too, my friend.